Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 2022 Budget and Grid Management Charge Process Initial Stakeholder Meeting. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by our presenters. We have Ryan Sagazio, Vice President, Chief Financial Officer, and Treasurer, April Gordon, Director, Financial Planning and Procurement, Lisa Johnson, Manager of Total Rewards. We also have Ken Kasparian on the line, our Senior Manager of Strategic Initiative Business Analysis, Jan Cogdill, our Lead Financial Planning, Denise Walsh, our Controller in Accounting, and Thomas Setliff, our Lead Financial Analyst. And then we also have a few other subject matter experts on the line. We have Jody Zamathis, our Vice President of Human Resources, Don Trethewey, our Principal of Market Design Policy, Jordan Pina, our Senior Counsel. We have James Lynn, our Senior Advisor in Market Settlement Design. And then we have Kim Leung, our Senior Budget Analyst in Financial Planning and Procurement. The presentation has been posted to the 2022 Budget and Grid Management Charge Process Recurring Stakeholder Process webpage. On that page, you will also find links to documents related to project release plans, project summaries, and also financial summaries. And we are recording today's call. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. So for the agenda today, before we jump into the topics, Ryan Sagazio is going to give just a few opening remarks. But then after Ryan's comments, we'll cover the revenue requirement and rates process. And then Lisa will go over the managing employee compensation topic. Ken will give an update regarding the project release plans. Jan will be covering the project summaries. Denise will cover the financial summaries. And then Thomas will help us wrap up with the 2022 calendar and next steps. And then after that, we'll open it up to the larger group for some stakeholder feedback and discussion. So this slide here just gives out the timeline. We have some more detailed dates at the end of the presentation. But as a general overview, we're here at the initial 2022 revenue requirement stakeholder meeting. And then from now through October 2021, we will continue our internal development process. And then in October, we will then post the preliminary draft 2022 revenue requirement and then present that draft to the board in November. And then we'll have an additional stakeholder call in November, again on the 2022 revenue requirement, and then present the final draft 2022 revenue requirement to the board for decision in December, and then go ahead and post those dates in December following that meeting. And then those new rates will become effective on January 1st, 2022. So with that, I will hand it over to Ryan for some opening remarks, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Isabella. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. As always, this represents the kickoff to the annual development of the revenue requirement. It's a chance for you to hear from really a variety of subject matter experts around the major components of the revenue requirement. You can ask questions, provide comments, and really learn about the process that'll happen over the next, say, 6 months. I always like to give a little bit of a preview of what's coming or what we're seeing for 2022. It's, if you've been around for a while, I think in general, the bottom line doesn't change very materially. There's always a lot of moving pieces, but the net revenue requirement has obviously remained stable now for some 15, 16 budget cycles. And I really don't anticipate at this point any change to that for 2022. I would say that the big items of focus that, we're currently looking at, on the negative front, we're definitely seeing labor cost inflation. You're seeing that really throughout the economy, and it's no different here. About this time of the year, Human Resources does some extensive analysis of the marketplace to make sure that, we're paying employees competitively, and we're seeing some pressure there. So we do anticipate some labor cost inflation. Additionally, I do see some net new headcount coming into the budget. We're doing kind of an analysis. We're hearing from market participants about certain areas that they feel do not have enough resources, potentially creating some bottlenecks. So we're doing an analysis right now to determine where those are and looking to inject some new headcount to solve some of those issues. On the positive side, we had a very successful debt refinancing earlier this year. If you recall, at the end of the budget process last year, we had embarked on that refinancing. We did go to the market in mid-January. It was the timing was outstanding. The deal was well oversubscribed. There was a great demand for taxable municipal paper at that time. We were able to price the bonds at really AA credit spreads versus our actual credit rating, which is single A. So it was outstanding. The debt service cost, or the interest cost, was cut in half. It went from about 4.5% on the old bonds down to actually a little less than 2.25% on the new bonds. And that represents really about a $2 million a year savings in the debt service component on the revenue requirement for the remaining 18 years of the bonds. So anyway, that will help offset some of the labor cost, pressures that we're seeing. And those are really kind of the two, I guess, main areas that we know about heading into the development of the 2022 revenue requirement. So I'll turn it over to April now. She's going to walk you through the whole process of how the revenue requirement's developed, and then maybe we can pause and open it up for some questions at that point.
All right, thanks, Ryan. Hi, folks. I'll walk you through the revenue requirement and rates process. Next slide, please. What you have in front of you are the components that make up the revenue requirement. There are 5 of them. The first 3 components really represent the costs we need to operate as an organization. The 2 other components are really offsets to those costs, and I'll just give a brief overview of each of those components. The largest component that we have in our revenue requirement is our O&M budget. Now, this component includes all of our personnel costs and non-personnel costs, and the budgets are developed with the budget owners along with our human resources group to really create a budget that meets our needs and so that we can move forward successfully into the year. The next component is our debt service, and as Ryan mentioned, we went through a refinancing earlier in the year, so we do anticipate this component going forward to be reduced from prior years. The next component is our cash-funded capital. Now, this is the component that we use to fund all of our projects throughout the year. And if you're familiar with our revenue requirement process, you'll know that we also put a portion of that capital fund over to our reserves so that we can go ahead and help stabilize our project needs over the multiple years to come. The next component is our other costs and revenues. To date, we've only used the revenues portion, and this really captures all of our supplemental revenue, like our EIM revenue, our RC revenue, our interest income, as well as our California-Oregon intertie revenue. All of those revenues that are captured in this component help to reduce our revenue requirement going into the year. And the final component is our operating cost reserve adjustment. And as I mentioned for prior years, this component actually makes us whole with the stakeholders. And what I mean by that is any year in which we over-collect in GMC or underspend an O&M budget, and then vice versa, that delta goes back to the stakeholders in a credit in the following year's revenue requirement. All 5 of those components make up our revenue requirement. Now, we use this as a base to determine what our GMC rates would be going into the next year. And what I mean by that is we take that revenue requirement, we multiply it by the different service category percentages that we have as determined by the last cost of service study. Those service categories are system operations, market services, and CRR services. The portion of those are going to be allocated out, and then we're going to divide those amounts by the projected volumes going into the year. And then we'll be able to determine what the rates will be. Isabella, next slide, please. Now we're going to go over some of the budgeting principles that we actually abide by during the year. The first is aligning the budget with our ISO strategic vision. The budget aligns with the vision, which helps us guide and meet our organizational and operational goals throughout the year. And those strategies include reliably managing the grid, efficient operation of the ISO markets, and the continued pursuit of operational excellence. By aligning the strategic planning process with the budget planning process, we're able to provide greater transparency into the ISO's resources and business and operation costs. And the ISO does remain steadfast in its efforts to manage those costs and utilize the corporate resources in a smart and prudent way. We also follow a strict fiscal discipline principle. And the ISO is able to maintain its fiscal discipline through efforts like following a zero-based budget and the regular financial reviews with our budget owners and our executive team. Following its firm commitment to the fiscal responsibility, we follow these processes, and that allows us to confront conventional thinking and resource allocations by challenging every line item and assumption. The budget request under the ZBB method, which is zero-based budgeting, requires justifications, which helps us avoid over-budgeting, double counting, and automatic budget increases year over year. The result of following these principles is the result of a justified and balanced budget, which is strategically aligned with the ISO's focus going into the year. The next principle that we follow is collaboration. The ISO's revenue requirement is collaboratively developed using the feedback not only from the stakeholders such as yourself, but also with its leadership team and with its management team over the budget. We also provide transparency through the process with the stakeholders and available information on its website. The ISO is able to provide transparency into all of its budgeting process. And the final principle that we follow is really staying underneath our FERC-mandated $202 million revenue requirement cap. Over the last 10+ years, the ISO's revenue requirement has remained under this cap. And following the fiscal responsibility, it's expanding its revenue streams with efforts like releasing EIM, RC service, and nodal pricing model revenue. It's contributed greatly to the ISO's long run of staying below the cap, despite investing in major market and other releases, as well as releasing or building out 2 new facilities. Even with inflationary and other pressures on the horizon, the ISO is projected to stay within its revenue requirement cap despite a stable growth within the coming years. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks, April. So to enter the question queue, you can do so by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. And you can also enter your question into the chat feature, and I can read that out to our panelists. Just a reminder that before you ask your question or make a comment, to please introduce yourself and state your organization or affiliation.
We do have a question in the verbal queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Good morning. This is Lauren Perkins on behalf of the Modesto Irrigation District as well as Silicon Valley Power. I just had a question on your last slide. I was curious what the operating cost reserve adjustment for 2020 was that was credited to customers.
The total amount of the operating cost reserve adjustment for 2020 has yet to be calculated. That'll be calculated as we go further into the revenue requirement. However, the reserve adjustment for the 2021 budget, if you're interested, was $13.6 million.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Lauren, this is Ryan. Just to give you a little more color, I think this year's budget, which April just gave you the $13 million. I think we're projecting similar amounts that'll be trued up, that'll go into the 2022 revenue requirement. We've had fairly large reserve credits the last couple of years. Probably the biggest rock that's causing that would be interest income. We've, the last 2 years, 2019 and 2020, were great years for fixed income investors. Your rates, fell in both years, so if you're a holder of fixed income, that's a benefit in the overall value of the portfolio. So we've probably had in both years, an estimate of maybe $4 million for interest income. And I think each year we ended up with like $10 or $11 million in interest income. So that's probably half that reserve credit that is for this year and what will go into the 2022 revenue requirement.
Thank you.
We do have another question in the queue, and caller, your line is unmuted.
Good morning. This is David Cohen with Guidehouse. How you doing, April?
Hi, David. Hey,
you knew I would. And come on. Can you go to your graph you were displaying after this slide? Is it possible to get the historical actual data of O&M, debt service, et cetera, that supports each one of those bars, 2012 through 2021?
Yeah, I think we could go ahead and put something out there like that. It's already included in budget books, but we can go ahead and simplify it for you.
Is the budget book been posted yet?
The budget book from 2021 and prior have, but not for 2022 yet. That won't be posted until the end of October.
Okay, so we won't be seeing a draft budget book then like we have in the past?
No, you'll be seeing the draft, but it won't be released until end of October.
Thank you, April.
You're welcome. Nice to have you back, David.
We have no further questions in the queue.
Okay. And I'll hand it over to Lisa Johnson, our Manager of Total Rewards for managing employee compensation.
Thank you, Isabella. Good morning, everyone. I'll be discussing how we manage our employee compensation. Next slide. Thank you. We currently manage our employee compensation in aligning with our ISO philosophy to attract, train, motivate, and retain top talent. We remain competitive with our pay by matching to market pay practices. Every other year, we participate in salary surveys that cover 100% of our ISO positions. We do maintain a pay for performance philosophy in which we set performance goals or high performance goals that are aligned with our corporate objectives. The board approved goals are cascaded and tailored to each individual employees when we set their objectives. At year end, we evaluate the employee performance against those objectives, and we do differentiate merit dollars based on performance. We maintain a strong performance management program that includes individual performance plans for our employees with stretch objectives and goals. And throughout the year, we provide ongoing feedback, coaching, and support for our employees. We do budget for merit and promotion pools and continue to optimize and utilization of our available salary dollars by ensuring employee merit increases are based on performance against those set goals and objectives. With that, I'd like to take any questions.
Again, to enter the question queue, you can do so by pressing #2 on your cell phone keypad.
We do have one question in the question queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hello, this is Lauren Perkins again on behalf of MID and SCP. Sorry, I'm having a bit of echo. Hopefully you can hear me. I had a question on whether the CAISO's November 2020 executive level leadership reorganization is reflected in any of the dollar figures shown in the 2020 audited financial statement. For example, perhaps in the $9.3 million increase in salaries and related benefits that's shown on page 10 of that report.
Hi, Lauren. This is Denise Walsh. I'm looking at page 10 of the 2020 audited financials. Is that the page you're referring to?
Yeah. Yep, it's 10 carry over to page 11. As shown increase between 2019 and 2020 salaries and related benefits.
Yes, I see that there. I'm going to ask my colleague April to help me out with this a little bit. There was an increase there. There was a reorg last fall. April, can you speak to the increase in salaries there?
Let me jump in. This is Ryan. I mean, so if you're looking at the financials, the audit financials, obviously that would be, actual, salary costs, for 2020. the increase would have been, largely in the budget for 2020 based on, probably just the usual merit and promotion budgets, any new headcount that was added in 2020. The reorg that happened toward the end of the year would have been, any dollar impact of that reorg would be in those actual numbers. And then obviously heading into the 2021 budget, there would have been any adjustments in the actual budgeted labor for that reorg, if that answers your question.
Okay, that's helpful. So it does reflect, that figure does reflect the reorg, but it will be further reflected in adjustments for the 2021 audited statements next year.
Yeah, because clearly the audited financials would cover any actual cash costs, that would happen out of any reorg during the year. But then clearly in the 2021 budget, then we would have planned for whatever the reorg looked like. And it's in this year's budget.
That's correct. Thank you, Ryan.
If you don't also mind me asking, you mentioned, Ryan, the new headcount. So there, in the audited statements, there's a reflection of 490 active employees, but if you look at the quarterly statements, it shows about 650 in that ballpark. And so I wonder what the reason for the discrepancy there is.
So the 490 that you're looking at in the audited financials, I assume that's in the retiree medical plan notes. And so that's a different number than actually the actual employees. What that represents is that there's 490 active employees participating in the retiree medical plan benefit. So that would be every employee that is currently taking medical benefits from us, because clearly there's some that don't. They might have a spouse that has a better plan, so they're not in our active plan. And we closed that plan to new employees effective January 1st, 2019. So anybody hired after 2019 or after January 1st, 2019 would not be eligible for that plan. So that's going to be a different number, always going to be lower than the actual headcount at the ISO.
Okay, that's a very helpful explanation. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, Lauren, those are actually two separate numbers, as Ryan is saying. That one is the retiree benefit plan, and one is the actual head count. That's what's reflected in the quarterlies.
Got it. Thank you.
We have no further questions in the queue.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. I'll hand it over to Ken Kasparian, our Senior Manager of Strategic Initiative Business Analysis for Project Release Plans.
Thank you, Isabel. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so these next two slides just are presenting you where you can find information. So beyond this meeting, to find more about the release plans and then the different groups. So I wanted to show you where you can get that information, and then we'll walk through the release plan for the this year and the next couple of years. So. Okay. Next slide. Share my desktop. I want to show you guys where to find this. Here we go. Okay, so from California ISO website, under Stay Informed, you're going to have both the release planning page and the meeting and events. So going on the release planning page is where the first slide was talking about. And here you can find the release schedule, which is a pictorial view of the different releases coming up the year, and then also the implementation milestones. So it'll be an Excel spreadsheet that has all of our implementation milestones that go with the different projects that we have out there. And so this is a good page for staying informed. You can get information down below here on 2021 releases, and as we get into 2022, you can get different documents. I think this is a good place to have as a bookmark for keeping up with our release plan. If I jump back to Stay Informed and go over to Meeting and Events, And then we jump to, scrolling toward the bottom, user groups and recurring meetings. That's the other link on the slide. And the ones I want to call out here is really the Market Performance and Planning Forum and the Release User Group. Those are two key meetings where you can get information on a regular basis. And then you can see some of those same links are right here for you for the release schedule and implementation milestones. Okay. I'm going to shift into right back real quick so we can keep moving forward with the slides. Okay. So this next slide is, as I was talking about, the Stay Informed, and you can find it on the meeting events, user groups and recurring meetings. So these are the two we pointed out, and there's your link to it as well. Thank you. Next slide. Perfect. So coming up for spring of 2022, we've got 4 EIM entities that are onboarding, and then we have 3 projects that are aligned with the release plan and tying in either EIM entities or policy initiatives. So we've got the flexible ramping products, the EIM base schedule submission deadline, and the hybrid resources phase 2B. Next slide. Moving into the fall, we've got a number of policy projects for external load forecast scheduling. This was also, you've heard of wheeling. It was an earlier name talked about. So this is the policy initiative, resource efficiency evaluation, day-ahead market enhancements, the tax structure enhancements, resource adequacy enhancements track 2, maximum import capacity enhancements, transmission registry replacement, and the NOPR for the managing transmission line ratings. Next slide, please. Spring of 2023, got 3 more EIM entities planned, and then we've got a list of the policy projects that are in our latest roadmap. So extend the day-ahead market to the EIM entities, frequency response measures, bird dispatch enhancements, scarcity pricing and system market power mitigation, the joint owned unit model, hybrid evolution, and energy storage enhancements. Pause here for questions.
Again, pressing #2 will enter you into the question queue.
We do have questions in the question queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hello, Lauren Perkins on behalf of MID and SVP. On your slide 13, where you show our enhancements track 2, and given this project appears on the preliminary project listing for the next 2 years, I'm wondering if the CAISO is not resuming the RA Enhancements Initiative this year. Currently, it's shown on the webpage that there's going to be a November 2021 board meeting, and I'm wondering if the initiative's been deferred.
So the first initiative that's out there covered a number of scope items, including what went in for the summer, but we're continuing on with the initiatives that were already covered. And my understanding is we will continue to move forward with the board as needed. Don't know if someone has more specifics. Don, if you have anything more specific from a policy side.
This is Don.
From implementation, we're moving forward.
This is Don. I don't have specifics on when they're going to resume the stakeholder initiative, but I know that we are having continuing internal discussions on the policy development for it. So I would anticipate that you would see something from us later this year.
Okay, thank you. So just to be clear, the phase 2A and 2B that was in the December stakeholder paper, that's going to be part of this RA Enhancements Track 2, but we might see something before next year?
So, Lauren, I'm not sure that the specifics on the 2A, 2B. I know from an implementation we had the summer readiness piece, And then we are talking about some items that are mixed in there. I'm not sure which exactly bucket they're on, around UCAP and some other of the pieces to try to get those scoped out and figure out an implementation timeline while still working with the policy team to finish up the stakeholder process. That help or?
Yeah, and John's statement too is helpful that, you know, there may be something later this year, so we'll keep an eye out. Thanks.
Yep, and I'll make a note for the RUG so we can also make sure we track that in there and be able to, as we get more information internally, continue to communicate that to you through that forum.
Thank you.
We do have another question in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hello, David Cohen with Guidehouse. Back on slide 13, Ken, can you elaborate on the TAC structure enhancements? Is that the concept of moving to a demand charge, or what does that really involve? And also, does the ISO plan to release a update to Neil's TAC forecasting tool?
So this is Don. I'll take that. So yes, this is the initiative that we completed a couple years back, where we're looking to modify the TAC to where it includes the demand charge as well as volumetric charges. So that's what that one is. We've been sort of holding it to ensure that there's consistency with where the extended day-ahead market may go, as well as looking at the external load forward scheduling rights. So it's one that we're why we haven't implemented it yet is we wanted to make sure it's consistent with some of these other policy developments that we're putting in place. And with regards to your question, will Neil update his TAC forecasts to reflect the demand charges and this? I would assume so, but I personally haven't worked on this initiative, but I would assume that we would.
Okay, follow-up, if I may. On the TAC demand concept, your process of figuring out whether or not you're going to go do that will have to have an implementation phase for the PTOs to actually then make a change in their filings, correct? At FERC.
That would all have to take back to ask them that. I'm not. I don't have the expertise to answer that. So if you can include that in your written comments, we can get you a response on that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just commenting. Be happy to put it in that it's the timeline of your proposal and circling in all the PTOs to then understand the time frame under which, I don't know, cart before the horse, you go to the board first or you go to FERC first and seek a change. But whatever, the PTOs would then, in order to be consistent with the ISO TAC methodology, have to do an update to FERC. That's my comment.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
We have no questions in the queue.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to project summary. So I'll turn it over to Jan Cogdill, our lead financial planner.
Hi. Can you go to the first page? Thank you. As April had indicated when she talked about the cash-funded capital, it is handled as a separate budget. For the current year, we're working with $22 million. At this point, about half of that has been approved and is committed for this year. I expect the rest of it, hopefully throughout the rest of the year, will be funded It will also, as we have always done in the past, we did post a preliminary proposed project listing and 2 other reports, which I will talk about. But in that project listing, which at this point is 74 items, some of those will be funded in 2021. When I prepare that list, I pick up everything that has not happened at this point in time because things do change throughout the year, and we want to have a fairly inclusive list of what is still a potential for funding. For 2022, we have a target of between 18 to 20 million. What happens right now is we have just started the project prioritization project or evaluation. We've actually had our first meeting. There will be several more meetings, and this involves directors and managers throughout the company to present projects that they think need to be done. We have a process that is actually run by Ken to help evaluate those based on criteria. That listing of what that criteria is found in our prior year budget book, and it lists all the items that we actually consider and rate these projects to determine what is going to be our top list that will fall within the annual target. And just so that you understand the rest of our process here, just because they're on a list of proposed projects, which will be posted in our final one will be posted in the final budget book in December of the items that we've identified. From that point, they actually go through a program office standardization process, which Ken was showing you the website. There's actually a document out there on the program office process if you are interested in understanding that more completely. But they have to go through that process, which includes business requirements, impact assessments, project plans. Those project plans then are presented to what we call our Corporate Management Committee, CMC, to get approval to proceed. The Corporate Management Committee is made up of our CEO, our CFO, and our General Counsel. The business units have to present and justify why we should proceed with these projects and the actual cost that they are estimating that will be used for that project. Until that is approved, no project moves forward, even if it is in our final listing at the end of the year. Next slide. The other 2 listings that we did post, one of them is a completed project list. This is everything that has completed since July of last year through June. And then we have an active project list that is as of the June 30th close. As you can see, we still have about 60 active projects, which obviously will grow as more projects are approved for the rest of the year. You want to go to the next one? What is not included in either one of these lists are our EIM entities. So we actually closed 5 additional projects for the EIM entities. We don't include those on the listing because they are not funded by ISO funds. They actually pay for the implementation costs individually. So there are an additional 7 active projects above the 60 that we currently have going. Are there any questions?
We do have a question in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hello, Warren Perkins for MID and SVP. I have a question for you on the active projects list regarding the 2021 campus operation funding. I guess before I ask that question, more generally, when there are 2 capital ID numbers for some of these, is that a carryover from a prior project, or what would be the reason for two ID numbers?
2 ID numbers indicate that there probably is a requirements project, or in the campus ops, or in particular, I don't break that one apart. It doesn't have a requirement. What that usually will indicate is whether I can capitalize the project or whether it's just a project that is technically an O&M project, but funding from the capital and project budget. So definitely on the active projects for campus ops, it's just going to include the project numbers, very specifically a capital number, and then a what we call O&M or non-capital number. And you'll see that on the hardware. You'll see that on the software. I mean, not the software, the facilities and the facilities reserve project, just because generally in the requirements and other projects, we are talking about software projects, so they have requirements and or they are a software project that I do list separately, number-wise, in these lists. That answer your question on that?
Yeah, and then going specifically to the 2021 campus operation funding, I was hoping that you could maybe describe a little bit what this project encompasses, and I'll have a couple follow-up questions, but first if you could give some color to that line item.
Well, these projects, they could encompass many different things for campus ops. It could be some of the costs that are in there, or if we have to do the preliminary work in our facilities, for example, new filters. They're not, that are very large in cost, like, you know, an $84,000 filter, not a normal O&M cost, and you never know when it's going to be needed. But it's also technically not a capitalizable cost to buy a filter like that. Some cases they would be, I'm trying to think right off the bat, I don't have my list up, but we actually do track each item. What happens when they have that kind of a budget is they actually have to write up a request. It's generally, especially in facilities, sometimes it's a replacement of LED lights. You know, that kind of a cost that are very expensive, you know, or running the $50,000 to $75,000 to do all of this cost. So that's why they actually we have a process internal where all of those things actually have to be formally requested, signed off by managers and directors, and occasionally an VP for these. You know, if you request that, I can actually give you a very specific listing, but not off the top of my head here right now, and I don't have my list up to give you some additional details, but be glad to provide that for you.
Okay. We could follow up in written comments on that. One follow-up question, I'm just wondering if CAISO is envisioning resuming on-campus operations in 2021 and whether that's factored into this forecasted amount here.
I think there are different things. This is capital budget, but it's on the O&M side. Maybe, Brian, it sounds like you wanted to jump in.
Well, yeah, I think the easy answer to that is we are currently planning on a return to the campus for the employees. October, the first week of October is the current target date. That'll be actually a voluntary return. And then by January 1st or January 3rd, whatever the first business day of January is, that'll be the mandatory return to the office. There is some campus operations expenses ahead of that, you know, COVID-related in terms of, I know they're doing some reshuffling of some of the tighter workspaces. There's some technology involved where they're, you know, trying to give us some more video capability to have, you know, to accommodate kind of a hybrid work schedule where some people may be remote. So anyway, that's probably part of what you're seeing in the campus ops as well. But yes, the return to the office will begin, you know, barring any major flare-up of COVID variants, but the first week of October.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
We have have no further questions in the verbal queue.
Okay, thank you. Now moving on to the financial summary, so I'll hand it over to Denise Walsh, our controller.
Oh, hi there. Thank you, Isabella. Yes, this is Denise, and today I'll be presenting a few slides to go over the financial summaries. First of all, I'll provide some very brief highlights of the 2020 audited financials. These were issued back in April, and then I'll provide a 2021 budget update for the year-to-date period through June this year. Looking at this current slide on the 2020 audited financial highlights, it's really two components, operating revenues and operating expenses. The operating revenues last year finished the year over budget in 2020. That was due to higher than expected GMC and other revenues, including EIM charges and large generation interconnection projects. The interest income is mentioned here, but it's actually not part of operating revenues. Ryan alluded earlier that interest income was up from our fixed income investments, but that is actually not part of interest income, but it is going towards, reducing the revenue requirement and actually helping to create a credit for the operating reserve. In terms of operating expenses, they finished the year under budget. A lot of categories were lower last year in terms of expenditure, including outside legal, contract staff, consultants, obviously travel due to COVID-19, and some of the salaries and benefits spend was down also. If there are no questions there, I'll move on to the update for 2021, and this is Q2 through June of this year. These are largely cumulative numbers. So year-to-date through June this year, the actual operating revenues, which include the GMC and other revenues, as mentioned, things like LGIP, EIM, administration charges, forecasting fees, and so forth, they were over budget by 2.3 based on actual revenues of about $110.4 million versus a budget of $108.1. This increase is comprised of higher GMC revenues due to the warmer than predicted weather patterns and $1.2 million increase in other revenues due to increase in a variety of categories, as I mentioned. We can move on to the next slide, please. Looking at the GMC through June 2021 separately, as this is the larger component of operating revenues, the GMC through June was higher than budget, as mentioned, by $1.1 million, based on actuals of $86.3 million versus a budget of $85.2 million. Next slide, please. Year-to-date through June, this is the O&M maintenance expenditures. And cumulatively, these were under budget through June by $2.5 million. This is based on actuals of $93.7 million versus a budget of $96.2 million. And finally, the cumulative capital expenditures for the year. Jan had mentioned this a little bit, earlier. There's a budget for 2021, which is $22 million. The approved projects through June amount to $11.7 million, and the expenditures through June on those projects is roughly $2.2 million. That's the end of my presentation for today. Do I have any questions?
We do have a verbal question in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Thank you. David Cohen, Guidehouse. Could you go back to slide 22? Do you attribute the GMC revenue decline for January, February to be because of COVID closures, or do you understand why actual is less?
Yeah, Dave, this is Ryan. I was going to say, yeah, in January and February, we definitely came in under what, the projected volumes were. It likely was due to still some, economic closure related to COVID, because we started to see that kind of come back in March as the economy came back. And then obviously May and June, it's probably just more related to, higher heat than what we had in the projected volumes. But weather is typically the main, variable here. But I think, COVID is, at least in the last year and a half, has also been, introduced as another kind of, main variable.
Thank you, Ryan. I thought so. I just wanted to see if you guys had any further insights. Thank you.
Yep.
I have no further questions in the queue.
All right. Thanks, Denise. Now I'll hand it over to Thomas Setliff, our lead financial analyst, for calendar and next steps.
Thank you, Isabella. To facilitate our continued involvement for all of our stakeholders, I'll go through the upcoming key calendar dates and the next steps. The internal development process is underway right now, and we'll go through October. For this meeting, our stakeholder comments, written comments, are due by July 29th. To do so, please submit your comments to the ISO's commenting tool using the template provided on that process's webpage. We have a slide coming up that walks through that process, as that tool has been deployed in the last year, so may be somewhat new to some of you. Once you receive those, we will post our responses to the stakeholder comments by August 5th. The next item on the agenda after that will be in late October. After the internal process is complete, we will be posting the preliminary draft 2022 revenue requirement by the 29th of October. Then that will be presented to the Board of Governors at the executive session on November 3rd. We will then have another stakeholder call to discuss that draft revenue requirement on November 15th. There will be another opportunity for written stakeholder comments, and those will be due to the ISO on November 22nd. And similar to the timing for this meeting, we will post our responses within 1 week by November 29th. Then the final draft of the revenue requirement will be presented to the Board of Governors during the general session on December 15th through the 16th. This will be the last opportunity for public comments to the board on that final draft revenue requirement, and during that meeting we will be requesting approval of that final draft 2022 revenue requirement. If approved, we will be posting the revenue requirement and rates to the ISO website by December 23rd, and those rates will be effective as of January 1st, 2022. Thank you.
Do you have any questions on the calendar dates and next steps?
We do have a question in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hello, this is Lauren Perkins. I actually had a question not on the next steps, but before that, a question on the Q2 2021 quarterly financial report. I was wondering if CAISO could explain why the focus on customer service and other cost budget is exceeded by about $518,000.
Hi, Lauren. This is Denise. The budget for which line item were you looking at again? I'm sorry.
It's on in the quarterly financial report for the capital projects report that appears on page 3. It's PDF page 6. There's a focus on customer service and other costs, and it shows that the budget is over by about $518,000.
Would it be possible for me to take that question in writing and do some research on that for you?
Certainly. Thank you.
That would be great. Thank you.
And I did have a couple questions because we have this time. This is not on next steps, but I know that that this call is supposed to go till noon, so hopefully there's time for a few more substantive questions. But on the active project list, it looks like RA Enhancements there's two different projects for track one. So if anyone on the call can explain the reason for that and what those different projects might encompass.
I have to unmute myself. Which numbers are you seeing? I think you're seeing a project number that starts with a 1, correct? 1, 2, 4, 6, 7?
Yeah.
Okay, and the other project number is on, it starts with a 2, 21445?
Yeah.
Is that correct? Okay. So as I kind of indicated before, it's a tracking mechanism within our system. The 2-1 project numbers indicate that I can't capitalize them. So generally what that means, it's going to be the business requirements, impact assessments, any cost incurred there. Also, if we happen to have software that we don't own, we call software as a service, those costs would also go against that project number, the 2-1 number. There again, we don't own it. I can't capitalize it. We have several applications out there that we are very dependent on that are like that. Our OMS system is one of them. So if a project has costs like that, it goes against this other number. And that's why we end up with two numbers on most projects, and you'll see them that way. I did 1 year try and combine them, and it confused people. So it was just easier to keep the project codes separate for people on these lists that I have provided. But you'll see that on various projects that maybe have that particular component. And I know the RA did very specifically have some contracts with our vendor for the OMS system. Does that answer your question on that one?
So the OMS system is it's the software that CAISO does not own that would be in the 2-1 project?
Yes, so any costs incurred, if we go out to that vendor and they have to do any development, of course, bill us. So in order to track that cost so I can actually pull the whole project back together on what it really is costing us, which is what we do, for reporting purposes, we have to be able to track those costs. It comes out of the capital and project budget. It's not coming out of O&M, but for financial purposes, it is an O&M cost. Does that make sense? The capital budget has to run following financial guidelines, and one of them is that there's certain items that cannot be capitalized. One of them is your requirements up to a point of trying to understand what you're going to do, all of that. Once you have a final solution, going forward, things can be capitalized. But most of our projects start with the cycle of an impact assessment, business requirements, all the cost gathering. That's all in a non-capitalizable requirements type project. And so it's tracked in that. But as a project, you've got to pull that plus the capital back together to know what that project really cost us.
Okay, that's very helpful. Yeah, and I'm sorry, you did note that for some of the numbers that appear in one line item, and so I understand why the two different RA enhancements could have been in one line item with those two different project numbers showing capitalized and non-capitalized, but it's just a different way of, okay. Thank you for this further explanation of your prior answer. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
Hey, Lauren, it's Ryan. Let me just backtrack real quick, too, and give you a little high-level commentary on your question on the Q2 financials, the capital projects report. The difference, like I said, like Denise said, we can follow up with what makes up that $2.5 million. But those we try to categorize, all the capital projects really into one of these four categories. And if you look at the 2021 budget book, the projects that made up the list, would have fallen in the categories that you see in that 2021 capital and project breakout, which, for focus on customer service and other was $2 million. But remember that list is really just kind of the working draft at that point. It's not necessarily the projects that will go forward in 2021. It's just at that point of the budget, those were the projects that would consume, the $22 million that the board authorized. Throughout the year, though, as projects are ready and are, finalized in terms of budget, then they are, categorized according to these 4 buckets. So it's not necessarily that category is over budget. It just means that projects have come in there that maybe weren't planned at the end of the year, and it could be for a variety of reasons, FERC orders or whatever else that, causes projects to differ from that final list. So anyway, we can give you the details on what makes that up, but it's not necessarily just an over budget amount.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, and we'll follow up with a written question if needed. Thanks.
Yep.
We have no further questions in the queue.
Okay. Then I'll just cover just a few more slides. So as Thomas mentioned, we will be taking comments through the ISO's commenting tool. So through this tool, users will have the ability to view all comments within a single click. So you'll be able to filter comments by both question or entity. So what you'll do is you'll log in and add your comments directly to the template and then submit, and you can save and return to your entry at any time during the open comment period. So the template is available out on the 2022 Budget and Grid Management Process webpage, and it will remain open through July 29th. But just an important note is that if it is your first time using the tool, you will need to fill out a registration. So once you register, you'll be good to go, and you'll be able to comment on this process and any of the other ISO stakeholder initiatives or processes. We did have a demo on the commenting tool last year, so a video on how to use that tool is available on the recurring stakeholder processes landing page if you would like to view it. And then as far as finding previous budget and GMC process web pages and related documents, you can do so by going to that recurring stakeholder processes landing page. And then in the status bar, you'll want to select in the drop-down menu, completed and closed. And then we have a search bar. You can just search the term budget, and it'll pull up a list of the previous budget and GMC process web pages, and you can click on those links, and it will take you to the documents and groups associated with those processes. So I'll stop and see if we have any questions on either of those 2 slides.
We do have a question in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hello, this is Lauren Perkins again for SVP and MID, and I apologize, Isabel, this is not a question on these slides, but I know we do have some more time, so if we could just maybe ask a few more substantive questions. The one question I have on the audited 2020 financial statements, there's a page where there's a breakdown of the operating revenues, and there are amounts noted for EIM revenues and EIM administrative charges, 2 different subcategories of operating revenues. I'm just curious if anyone on the call can explain what the difference between those 2 is. What does the EIM revenues include? I only knew EIM administrative charge, but the separate category, I wonder if someone could explain that.
Lauren, this is Denise. Can you just tell me what page you're on?
Sure. This is PDF page 12, but page 10 of the audited 2020 financial statements.
Well, Denise is looking that up. I think I can probably answer that. Denise can confirm it. But I think EIM revenues, that's going to refer to the reimbursement for their implementations, right? So they're, as Jan mentioned, we don't pay for the capital costs of the implementation. They do reimburse us. That comes in as an EIM revenue stream because we have expenses that offset that. But then the EIM administrative charge would be obviously the rates that they're paying for the volume activity. But Denise, you can confirm that.
Nope, that's right.
Okay. Thank you. And one more question on the active projects list. If someone can maybe address what the CRR system replacement project entails, and maybe a comparison of what, there's a completed project with the same name, and so maybe if you could just discuss those two and contrast them a bit. Thanks.
Okay, this is Jan again. You're seeing it on the active list at this point in time is the actual project going forward. On the inactive list, that is the requirements, because this particular project doesn't, at this point, doesn't appear to have products or other applications like the OMS that are going to impact it, that it will need additional funding in the non-capital O&M arena. So at this point in time, the requirements piece, which is what you're going to see on the closed project, I believe I'd have to double check the numbers here, but I'm assuming that that is a 2-1 number that you're seeing on the closed project one. Yes. That's really the difference. I don't keep them active, the requirements piece, unless there really is going to be a need to be able to charge additional costs there. We make the assumption that once a project has really gone on and gotten approval and is in the design, the capitalizable phases of a project, the design, development, testing, that we shouldn't be going back to the requirements piece. So that project is generally closed out. That explain. You may see that on projects too that way. But like I mentioned in the case of the RA, that project had continuing non-capitalizable costs. So therefore, we keep that one active until all the costs have been incurred. And I know on that one in particular, I haven't received all the invoices from the vendor for the OMS system. So it remains active with dollars waiting to be have vendor charges against it.
Okay. Thank you, and we'll follow up with questions if needed.
Okay.
We have no further questions in the queue.
Okay. If there are no further questions, that would conclude today's stakeholder call. And thank you all very much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your week.